right back, Austin, where they do the annals of
Guys, welcome to the 45. We're back. I have been watching a Dairy Portnoy pizza review because I'm addicted to watching all of these. I have a mic here, but I did not bring my converter, so I'm going to be speaking into the computer microphone. My guest today is incredible, and he'll be joining us in a minute. Any minute. It's kind of okay that I don't have a mic because I want him to do the talking. Nick is someone I met during COVID. He's a writer, worked in advertising in the agency world in New York for years. Just super fascinating guy, and excited for you guys to meet him. So we will await his arrival.
Gonna power his way through.
Well, Nick, dude, appreciate you making the time. I didn't tell you anything to prepare for this at all, but I have spent the last 24 hours, I feel like, meeting you again via reading everything you've written and put out online. And you've got such a crazy story in the time that we met. Obviously, we met during COVID. But it was, you and I have become good friends, but I hadn't, reading back through everything that you've written was it was a freaking thrill, dude. So throughout this, I'm gonna quote you a few times.
Love it, man. Thanks for taking the time to read my stuff again. I appreciate it.
Of course, man. So August 20th, 2020, you put out a piece, and at the end of it, you quoted one of my favorite books, East of Eden, and you actually quoted something that I didn't realize took place, which is when a guy in the story named Lee pulls out Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And I guess I need to reread the book, but I'm just going to read that quote, and I'm going to read kind of how you signed off this piece, and I want you to kind of talk about it. So this is the quote from the book. It says, "Everything is only for a day, both that which remembers and that which is remembered. Observe constantly that all things take place by change, and accustom thyself to consider that the nature of the universe loves nothing so much as to change things which are, and to make new things like them. For everything that exists is in a manner the seed of that which will be." End quote. And you finish by saying, "Farewell for now, New York. If there's a better place to live, I'm not ready to find it. I like to think I'll be back, but as we know, the universe is privy to its own plans. For now, I'll raise a glass to the impossibility of it all, a toast to the uncertain future, to the good and bad, the hope and fear, the love and hate, the lost and found. Breathe deeply in the balance and exhale." So Nick, that was
I haven't thought about that one in a while.
So that was 3 years ago. We had no idea what we were. God knows you didn't know what these last 3 years have been for you, but I wonder what it's like to reflect on everything that's happened since then.
Yeah, it's funny. That essay, that was a really interesting weekend. I live in New York City. I was living in New York City, I think going on year 3, and I loved living in New York City. I was working for an ad agency downtown, and just like really settling into the routine. I was single and living with one of my good buddies, and COVID, tore through that. It was crazy when COVID came through, especially in New York City. It was like super bleak, and I think the contrast for anyone that didn't live in like a major city when COVID happened might not appreciate it, especially when you're, young and you're single and you're, you have full agency over your life. When that came through, it was like all of a sudden it just stopped, like all of that. And there was this weekend, I luckily I came home. I was able to live at my parents' place out in Long Island. So, I was 30. I was about to turn 30. and I went back and I was living in the same house I grew up in all of a sudden. And there was really no, that first spring, there was really no like light at the end of the tunnel. If I'm sure you remember it, Cole, but it was super bleak. And basically my roommate and I, we basically had to just give up on our lease. It didn't make sense to live in New York anymore because there wasn't even enough space in our apartment for both of us to like those New York City apartments are not designed to work out of all day long. So very
Yeah.
quickly it went from I have an apartment in the greatest city in the world. You're like I feel like I'm in solitary confinement. So there was this weekend about 6 months after where we had to go back. I had to go back to my apartment, basically move out of it. So it was like this one final weekend where I basically had to like make peace with leaving my home in New York City and also make peace with like this abrupt end and leaving this chapter in my life that I really loved. And I was in Central Park, and I just witnessed this really beautiful thing happen where this couple is Central Park, and this is what the essay is about. So, anyone who's listening can read it if they'd like. But this couple in the Great Lawn, which is like it's like on the weekends, it's like a mass hangout, almost as like a beach type setting where everyone brings like blankets and Bluetooth speakers, and it's like
It's
a
incredible.
picnic and yeah, and during COVID, that was like the one spot you could go and you could still kind of social distance but hang out. And this one couple, they lost their kid, like their kid, and there's hundreds of people walking around, so it's a little frenetic. Um, and it became this scene where like everyone on the lawn, like it's probably like 300 of us, like took notice because the parents were freaking out that their kid got like that their kid was lost, and
Yeah.
there was this building tension where the longer that this went, it was like, oh my god, like what happened to their kid? I first thought like they lost their dog, but with the way they were reacting, it was like visceral, like oh my god, like they're really scared right now. And then there was this amazing moment where this stranger found their kid and like walked back, and like it was like the analogy I used was if it was like Moses parting the Red Sea, like everyone on the lawn, like peak COVID, peak like bleak political news cycles and death tolls and curves that weren't going down, like it was this just really beautiful moment that I thought was very representative of New York. And it was like this shot of life and collective positivity, and like the tribalism went away for a second, and it was just I was sitting there and I said that's I got to write about this. And
Yeah.
um, I kind of try to thread it with my own story. And I don't know, the way I've always approached my writing, like I've never been the type of writer that's been able to like knock out newsletters on like a cadence or like a consistent publishing schedule. I it's not going to work unless I really feel like I have a way of writing it, and I feel like called or pulled to write it. That's always
Yeah.
when my best stuff comes out. So yeah, I
Sure.
appreciate you calling that back.
Yeah, man. No, it's as mentioned, dude. Um, it's been such a joy, becoming friends over the years that I was reminded like how we first found out about each other, and it's like something that you talk about in your writing, which is you know the internet for all the ways in which it's made our lives more complex. It also, I think that what people don't think about is how early we still are and how the internet is changing every facet of our lives. And I know that we met frankly because we were talking about an old Catholic monk named Thomas Merton, and it's like it. I appreciate one thing about like having somewhat of a presence online is that you find other people who are interested in these the most random of things, and um, I'm thankful for that for sure. So one thing that is always a cool party trick when you're around Nick is it's easy to talk about your writing, and that's obviously something you're passionate about, but I want to hear and this is something you and I haven't even talked about, but your time working for Letterman. How did that come about?
Oh yeah, wow. Oh man, cool. You do your research. Uh, I was a page, yeah. I was a film. I studied film in college, and I really wanted to. I wanted to be a documentary filmmaker, and of course, when you graduate, like you're just trying to get a production assistant job on like
So how
anything
did, why did
that'll work.
how did you come upon the aspiration to be a documentary filmmaker?
I was drawn to it. I think it kind of. I always loved like filmmaking or movies, and I was like a story. It's actually funny because I think the fact that I love writing, and especially my latest story, is like kind of where it was naturally, I think, going to go the whole time, like storytelling and writing, writing stories, which is like the rawest form of the craft. But I was in college and I was a film. I studied film, and I just like wasn't into. I never felt like I was like writing a script and getting characters to act. Like it's funny in college, like you watch student films and it's all like people have their friends acting, and I just like knew I was like that doesn't seem like something that seems believable to me. So I shifted it, and I was like I want to do documentary filmmaking, and because that just felt like more there's more truth in there, like with like the capabilities and the tech I had. And I was teaching myself how to use Final Cut Pro. And senior year, I remember I was going to for my senior thesis project. I had this idea of like doing a leaving college. I lived in a house with 10 friends, Providence College, and I was going to do like a documentary on like us transitioning out of college and like what everyone's plans were. And that fall, one of my best friends from high school was killed in a motorcycle accident, and
Mm.
he was a super special, just a really special like magnanimous guy who he just kind of had life figured out at a very young age, which is why it was such like a enormous loss for all of us. And I quickly shifted because this was in September of 2012, and I was September of 2011. Sorry, and I decided to make my documentary film for my senior thesis like a memorial film for him. So I spent that year collecting clips from his childhood, like reaching out to his friends and family members, collecting pictures, and just kind of editing this ultimately like this eulogy piece for him, that I think came out really well. And back then, like you know, going viral was just like a new thing, but I remember I posted on my Vimeo and it kind of took off. Like it had a show on MTV reposted it called The Buried Life, and all of a sudden it had like 12,000 views in 2 or 3 days. And
Yeah.
that was the first time for me where I was like, all right, I think like not only am I proud of this and happy that I was able to do, show others like the life this guy lived and the lessons I learned from him, but I think I have a knack for this of being able to like pull these stories. So that for me was when I started like reality, this true stories became like more important to me. I think they still are like there's so many amazing stories to tell, and it's a matter of how to tell them.
100%, man. Well, I think what you said about writing being at the heart of I mean, whether it's on television, you're reading on a page, like, it all comes down to that, and it ain't easy. That's for sure. I want to talk about
No,
the
it's
most
not.
recent story you've told. How in the heck did you decide to go to Spain? And what about that trip
Well,
was
yeah,
made it going?
yeah. Well, you and I think talked about the Camino, before I decided to do it. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I got knocked around a little bit. Like I've had a rough stretch in like corporate America, especially during COVID. Like I said, to pick up where my other essay story left off, I went home for 3 years. I like worked remotely from my parents' house. I wasn't really dating. I had a few false starts, like business wise or nothing. I just wasn't really getting traction on a lot. And I ended up, getting into a pretty depressed place in my life. My brother and I had written this story on this NFL player named Steve Gleason, who had ALS, and it was like this awesome experience for us to tell his story and write that. And I was just looking for. I was like, I felt like I needed something else to like experience and write about. Um, and I hit this point where, and I talk about this in the latest story, where I was like, I need to do some solo traveling because I need to like I gotten a job offer to move back into like it would have got me back in New York, but it would have been totally remote. And it was like the way the interview, the guy he kept describing it as a eat what you kill compensation structure. And I remember thinking like, I can't handle this is not for me. So um, I decided to go to Spain to walk the Camino. I was thinking about maybe doing Southeast Asia like as like a solo trip, but ultimately um, the Camino felt right because for anyone who doesn't know, it's about a 4 to 5 week endeavor. The French route, which is the one I did, it's 500 miles. You start in France in the Pyrenees and you end in Santiago de Compostela, which is from the northeast part of the country to the northwest part of the country near the coast. Um, and I wanted something. The reason I did it, is because I just wanted to like shock some life back into my system.
Right.
But it was also this very like kind of the Camino. It's definitely not like a vacation. Like it's a pilgrimage. So it's contemplative and it's meditative and it's hard and you're not living in like it's beautiful too for all these reasons. It's beautiful because it's very like it's like the antithesis of my life during COVID. So rather than be in a room, be behind a screen, checking your Slack, checking your email, not really getting out in the sun and getting exercise, or meeting people outside of like your comfort zone or your bubble or whatever you want to call it, this just blew that wide open. And you're walking anywhere from like 15 to 20 miles a day through the Spanish countryside, and you're going through small cities and big cities, and along the way, it's called the Way is the nickname for it, the Way of St. James. You're meeting just a myriad of like seekers and people that are doing this for reasons. It's a Catholic pilgrimage historically, but it has become this multifaceted spiritual experience, and you're dealing and secular too, I'd say, where it's kind of taken on like it's kind of like you get everyone, man. You get hippies, you get people that were just freshly retired from their career as like a principal or a teacher. You walk with people who lost a spouse or just recently got divorced or who are struggling with something and they just needed something. They needed a reset. So it's like it's a very active solitude, I think, is the way to put it. And the whole thing, the more I got into it, the more you realize like this whole thing has like a metaphorical nature to it, right? Like, and it's like a super fertile storytelling inspiration, because so I had a journal that I every night before I went to bed, I'd spend like 10 to 15 minutes like writing down, like I'd fill like a whole page of like bullet points of like I met this person and they told me, the first day I wrote about this guy named Liam I met, which is what my story's about.
Yeah.
He was a doctor an emergency room doctor during COVID. He had PTSD, and he was doing this. He was walking the Camino because he just wasn't sure if he wanted to be a doctor anymore, and he just needed to work that out on his own. So those are the types of conversations you have, and of course, what's really powerful about it is like you get right into it. Like you're stripped back. You're wearing you bring two pairs of clothes because the backpack, like the more you carry is the more weight is the more the more it's going to
Yeah.
suck carrying that weight, right?
Sure.
So there's this, again, like metaphorical component of like the less you carry, man, the easier it'll be, and that's in your
Yeah.
head too, I think.
Yeah,
So yeah,
right
I could
on.
talk about that and I would just wrap up that point by saying, so I'm not sure if you're recording the video, but like, so I had a guidebook, like
I
there's
am.
these Camino de Santiago guidebooks, and the in the preface of this book's written by this guy named John Brearley. He makes his point around this interesting fact that in a lot of ways I think this story is, I'm trying to explore this myself, where he talks about how organized religion, the percentage of the population of people who practice organized religion in Spain, but I think Spain can be representative of the entire Western world, has plummeted, right? Like plummeted in the past 10 years. Like less than 20% of people in Spain practice a form of organized religion. But in the same 20-year period, it might be 10-year, I'll have to fact check that.
Yeah,
The
Nick. I
amount of
was.
people who are walking this the amount of people who are walking this pilgrimage has been almost exactly inverse. So what do you make of that? And I think that was really interesting to me in my own like experience of like what am I going to make of that? I'm also going through this like, so it was interesting. It was just it made for, and I'm exploring that in these stories I'm trying to tell about it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Nick, it's funny. I'm sitting here on my iPad. As you can see, I've got this circled, which was exactly what you talked about, this inverse relationship between the people that are walking this ancient spiritual path, clearly asking the fundamental questions of life, how the traffic on that trail has increased and people's interest in organized religion has decreased in the same time. Um, it's it's definitely fascinating.
Yeah, it's just an interesting, the tension of that I think is very human, you know, and you come out of this place of universal, like it's called suffering during COVID, and that was what was also cool about the Camino is like you don't really appreciate like everyone in the world went through that, you
Right.
know, equally at different, you know, different, but pretty consistently.
Sure.
Um, and I think it's funny because there has been, you know, I'm trying to think about how I get my story out, if I can pitch it as a book, like how do I, and I, you know, a lot of people have written about the way before. There's been movies made about it. Um, there's been books. We've talked about some of the books. But I think it's like this endless, perpetual stage are like anthological setup to tell these stories because ultimately it's like humans from all different backgrounds with different stories coming to figure themselves out on the way to like this church at the end, this cathedral. um and what you don't when you're walking this thing, like you kind of realize it hits you. I mean, you have low moments like the 3 days into it. I didn't get good sleep. People are snoring. You're sleeping in
How
these.
much drinking is done on this trail? I feel like everything I read, it's like, well, we stopped for the night, we drank a bunch of wine at the pub,
Oh yeah, well,
got
because
back.
they hand you, first of all, you're. It's funny because there is like a revelrous element to it where like you go to, they call them pilgrims meals, where you go to like the local restaurant, or yeah, the local spots in town, and for like €10 you get to pick a pasta dish, a protein, a dessert, and then they just put a bottle of wine on your table. And along the way, you're also stopping. I mean, you're walking so much and you feel great because you're getting like exercise. You almost like need, I was like convincing myself, I was like, oh, I need the carbs of like the beer at the end of the, like halfway through the day, you'd be like, let's stop and get some tapas and like a delicious ice cold beer. I was smoking hand rolled cigarettes that like these Italians in the beginning.
No, sorry.
I was walking with, they would make their own coffee and were hand rolling cigarettes. So that was great. I came home with a nicotine addiction from the pilgrimage. But, but you know,
Worst things,
but
I suppose.
yeah, yeah. So there's definitely like a you can't really party hard because you got to wake up and walk. So the more you're like, it's not fun to walk 20
Yeah,
miles hungover with like a backpack in the sun.
sure.
But the most amazing thing for this that came out, because typically most people are walking alone. Like you certainly see people who are walking with friends, or um, maybe like a husband and wife are doing it. That's like not uncommon, but I'd say 80% of people are walking this solo. So you tend to like find your group of people, or your group of friends. They call it your Camino family, who just become like your support system and your team, and almost like your roommates on this thing that you eat together, you book accommodations together. I didn't really find my group until the last half of it, so I kind of had fun like bouncing around, meeting different groups of people. Like you meet friends for a few days and then you never see them again, but that doesn't take anything away from like
Or
like I
sometimes,
connected with.
or
What was that?
sometimes you meet a girl, or sometimes you meet a girl from the Netherlands and end up in a long distance
Yes,
relationship with her.
right. So I was going to add to that. So I met with 5 days left. Um, my now girlfriend, this Jaleesa, she's from the Netherlands, and we met at an albergue with literally 5 days left at a
An
pool, and
albergue?
I
What
was
is
like, oh
that?
man, an albergue is just a pilgrim's hostel.
Oh,
So it's just a
okay.
hostel. It's
Got
just a hostel, but some of them are nice. Like this one that I met her at, like it had a pool, and we were hanging out, and like you basically wrap up your day, and you in the early afternoon if you're not lazy and you get going. So you get in, you've just walked 15 miles, you put your stuff down, you take a shower, you like grab a beer, and it was like this time of year actually, like
it.
late September, early October.
Yeah.
Um, so I was like, man, that girl's really pretty. I'm gonna, I think I want to try to talk to her. And it was funny. Like we, but we walked together for a few days. Like I finally caught up with her again, because you tend to, what's cool about it is you get to know, I'd say you get to know like the 200 people within 2 or 3 days of you. So you kind of become familiar with their faces. And by the end of it, you have this like big group of this community that you're
Yeah.
walking at the same tempo with. Um, but yeah, I basically fell in love with this girl with 5 days left. That became this one of the most amazing stories of my life. And she had a whole trip planned to South America shortly after, and I went with her. So, and now we're trying to figure out. I'm actually going to head over to the Netherlands in a month. We've been going back and forth to try to figure it out, but it's an incredible. I mean, it's like a ridiculous thing. Of all places, like I meet this girl in Spain,
It is. But what more could you ask
who's
for, man? I mean, truly, I look at your like your journey over the last few years, and like it's been incredible just as your friend from afar to see how things are unfolding. Well, Nick, I want to circle back to something you said a minute ago that like I just am interested to hear your perspective on this. But you talked about your buddy
sure
that,
thing.
that passed away. That he said he kind of figured life out at a young age, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that and you know talk about what the heck like your opinion is of what it means to figure life out.
That's a great question, man. Okay, yeah. So my friend Jake, it's when I was telling his story of his life, a lot of people commented that it's almost like he knew that he only had a limited time, because he just said yes to everything. He was just happy. He was like a radiating light and positivity. He never. We always joke that he just like never seemed stressed about work and like school obligations and where he was going to go to college. He just always had this like, hey, everything's going to work out. Like he was very he was very wise beyond his years in that way. And I think what I learned from him is that, and I've tried to adopt this. I've literally lived my life. He's impacted my philosophy, where you don't know um, when you're going to go, man. Like, and your life is happening. now, right? Like it's happening now. So go on the trip, take the chance, like get on the plane to go meet the Dutch girl that you met on the Camino, because that's the good stuff, man. Like that's what I think he was such an epic guy to make a documentary on, because it was like this eulogy for him where he just really lived. Like it was devastating that he died tragically, but he squeezed so much life out of his 21 years that I think a lot of our society is engineered to like it's like this mimetic desire of like go to a good college, get a job, get married, buy a house, retire. It's like the end where none of us are making it out, right? Um, and whether you believe there's like life after death and that there's elements of transcendence and continuation, like you might as well take advantage of it, right? And I think there's just a way that I try to live my life in a way that like I'm not going to regret things looking back. And of course, when you live like that, like you open yourself up to heartbreak and vulnerability and failure,
Right.
and like I have fallen on my face, like especially with my career, many times before, and in relationships. But you have like that's the good stuff happens when like you just go for it, right? Like even writing online. I mean, your stuff too, Cole. Like we look at you. You're making art now, and like you're doing great, and but there's that vulnerability of posting something and one person likes it, right? Or like no one
My
shares it, and
grandma likes it. My
you
grandmother comments and says, "Cole, I love the drawings."
yeah, so yeah, right. Your grandma likes it, but you got to put yourself out there, man. Like if you want to be a creative person online, like we have, and that's what you and me had connect from this originally through visualized value and a lot of Jack's stuff and his philosophy, his like permissionless philosophy. Like there's never been a better time. There's never been a better time to create things with your own name and put them online and get them out to people. And the internet is massive. And all of a sudden you're having like, look at you and I, our friendship was born out of that. Now we're having this conversation, and who knows how many people will listen to this. But sometimes I think, it's cool in a way having a record of your thoughts and your insights and the way you think about the world, especially if you work on the craft of it and it's something you like
Yeah.
put energy toward. Because man, I've spent hundreds of hours working jobs where like I don't get the credit for the work I do, right? It's a group effort, but it's capitalism and it's corporate America. And I for whatever reason have a instinctual pull that like I as a storyteller, the ultimately in what may be a selfish way, you want as many people to when you put attention and energy and time into crafting something, you
Well, it's
want the
also
world to see it.
you also, if you do that, if you're the man in the arena per se, you carry the risk of failure. And a lot of people, if you stay in a group setting your whole life, you don't have to deal with that. And I think one
Yeah.
thing that like being friends with guys like you has encouraged me is kind of just say like, screw it. Like I, if you care what people think about your art too much anyway, then you can kind of lose the fact that the most important thing is that you like it.
Yeah.
And real
Yeah.
art seems to be made when someone is connected and they're doing something that genuine that they love. I mean, that's a key
You,
in my.
I think that's a great, you're absolutely right. Because there's a funny thing that happens where, um, the more you put yourself out there, the more like if you know that people are gonna okay, I'm gonna post this on my Instagram or my LinkedIn, this story I wrote about the Camino de Santiago, like you're gonna write it as well as you possibly can, and because you have that insecurity of like people are gonna read this and they should judge me based off the story I'm trying to tell. So you write it as well as you can, and then you get the reps in of doing it, and then you get better at it. And I look back at some of my old stories I wrote, on, um, on Substack, and I can't help myself, but like, I just, I for whatever reason have a like a instinct towards like I like I as a storyteller, the more you put yourself out there, the more like if you know that people are gonna okay, I'm gonna post this on my Instagram or my LinkedIn, this story I wrote about the Camino de Santiago, like you're gonna write it as well as you possibly can, and because but go in and edit sentences because I'm like, oh man, geez, that was a rough sentence, or that was a weak analogy you use. Like I can't help myself because it's my art, you
Right.
know. But the I think the lesson in there is like the reps. You all of a sudden you're pretty good at it, and you know how
Right.
to do it, and all of a sudden someone might pay you to do it, and but to your point, it's it's so you do it like I only publish something, and I'm sure you're similar where I'm like I think that's good enough to be published now, and that's after many drafts and revisions, right?
You
And
got to be proud of it, right?
it's yeah, you got to be and if you, but I think what you know, I'm sure like yeah, the man of the arena type of thing. I think your natural insecurity as a creator is that people are like, oh man, what's he posting another story, or what's Cole posting another one of his pictures. But actually what's happening is like if you get to a point where you feel like it's good enough, you're good, man. You don't need anyone to like it, and you don't care if anyone likes it or shares it or maybe doesn't get it, because you're like, I'm proud of that and I think that's good, so I'm gonna put it out there. And
Yeah.
you learn to trust. I think you learn to trust your taste and your intuition, and it is like the best way to improve. You know, I've been playing guitar for about 6 years now, and I always think it's funny. I always think it's funny when people are like, "Oh, you're talented at the guitar," or like you have a lot of talent, and it's like I don't have talent, man. Like I just and hey, this is probably being single during COVID helped, and having a buddy who was really good that I could jam with, but like just hundreds of hours, like looking
Yeah.
at lessons, getting your fingers tough, muscle memory, like so. I think the same. I think we I just wish more people would create for their own sake and be willing to be bad at something and suck at something and write something that's not that good, or draw something that's not that good, because the first drafts are gonna suck. Like it's not going to be good at first, but all of a sudden you'll start finding it.
Yeah, that's right. Like, I mean, and really, if you're playing it, I mean, the long game, as far as it's something that you love, like you probably love it or some form of it forever if you found something that you actually love. And so it's like, it's like God, if 10 years from now I don't look back and what I've created is bad, then like that's when something's wrong. Like,
Exactly.
it's constant growth
Exactly.
until the day you die, and that's what I think is so inspiring to me, Nick. I mean, you're a guy who you mentioned earlier that you didn't not that well versed in art history, but you're talking to a guy on the other side of the screen that till 2 years ago I really didn't even realize that art, the art world and the artistic way of looking at life. I think it took me like failing and trying to fit myself in so many different um, boxes in life until I finally wound up stumbling upon like the art world and reading how the artists throughout history just describe like the human condition and how they see the world. And it was the first time that I had like a something to relate to in a way. So I wonder for you, like you're someone
Hmm.
who you studied it in college. Like when was it that you realized like that you had this passion, this interest in the art world?
I've just always found that uh, stories like a good. It's comforting when you realize that like the insecurities you have and your fears and heartbreak, um, it's all been written about before.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
it's all out there, and any good artist, I think like the best art comes from like rendering suffering and pain into like a beautiful. I mean, I'm listening to this biography on Van Gogh right now. He's one of my favorites, and I mean, he was like a deeply troubled guy who like was an outcast from his family, who no one believed in. His brother was the only one that believed in him. So it's just amazing to think about that, and it's comforting, and that he was able to create like just these incredibly beautiful depictions of the way he saw the world. Um, and that was intertwined, like that was because that was like in spite of his mental illness and his like depression and manic state, and he never found love, and he never felt accepted by society. And look what he
Well,
did, right? Like it's
right.
incredible.
I
So
mean, it
that to
just
me,
seems
you like to answer your question. That's just it's always been it's comforting. And music and art and stories, I think, have a special power in them, right? Like if a story leaves you, George Saunders is one of my favorite living writers right now, and he's become a master of the short story, and he has this book called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, where he basically lays out six Russian short stories, and the Russians were considered like the masters of the short story, and he just analyzes them and talks about. And it was like this revolutionary form of art because it was going against the grain of what was happening politically in Russia, and ultimately like hiding these little moments of like truth and rebellion and beauty to the public in a time where like it wasn't acceptable to like talk about these themes. So what's that? I mean, there's that famous the quote. I forgot who said it. That like a good story is the most powerful way to like change the world. I'm messing up the quote, but
yeah,
there's
yeah.
nothing more powerful than a story to change someone's mind, right? So like you could talk, like you could try to like hammer someone over the head with like religious doctrine of why like you should believe in God and read these verses of the Bible and study this saint, and that like has never really worked for me. But then I look at like the story that my brother and I wrote about um, Steve Gleason, who has ALS, 12 years, has a young family. Like you're talking about like immense suffering, ALS, like as bad as it gets, man. Like you can only move your eyes. Everything else goes, and you're still just as sharp intellectually. Okay,
Yeah.
this guy was diagnosed with ALS 6 weeks after. Oh, sorry, 6 weeks after he was diagnosed with ALS, retired from the NFL, found out his wife was pregnant with their first child. Okay, so like just imagine that you go 2 years where you lose every functioning muscle of your body. You have to have full-time care. The only way you communicate with the world is through your eyes on an iPad. That's how you type. You have to type letters with your eyes. And yet through it all, this man is an unbelievably happy person, and he loves his life, and he's you talk to him and you read what he writes and the way he thinks about his family and the world, and it's the most like heartbreakingly beautiful stuff you can ever read, right? And for
Yeah.
me, like it's like what is going on with that? So I've always been drawn to those as like a writer or storyteller. Like I've always been drawn to those like little crevices of like that shouldn't make sense but it does. Let's I for me want to explore that because I don't understand how that guy's happy, or
Yeah.
not only happy but like fired up about his life, right? And
Right.
so I think there's those types of stories. I mean, you're a spiritual guy, Cole. We've always connected on that stuff. Like I think a lot of people in our day with like the organized religion, church going numbers are down. People, it's not really, you talk about religion, it's like, it's not a cool thing to talk about. It's not a cool conversation to have, but we are like, I believe like we're spiritual beings, and there's like a yearning for that. Right.
Yeah.
So don't, it's like, you can't just outsource that. That's something to like engage with and think about. And there's evidences of like grace, and sure, there's like terrible, like the world is filled with terrible things, but it's also filled with like immensely like beautiful stories that you don't have to like, that are real and
Yeah.
it's not fiction.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's so true, man. And I think a lot about what it means even to this the spiritual life, the art world, and all the crossover there, man. It's just I think that's what fascinates me like as much as anything else. You know, you grew up in the Catholic tradition, and I kind of got exposed to that later in life. But I was reading last month. It was written. The Pope wrote a letter after Vatican II, and it's like a letter to artists. Have you read this?
Yeah. I
Dude,
think you might have sent that to me. Yeah, you or
okay.
my mom sent it to me. Yeah.
Classic.
Yeah.
But dude, it just blew my mind. I grew up like in the Baptist church, which was phenomenal, and like I'm really grateful and like love my church back home, and I think it's
Sure.
all good. But like art was not something that like we like talked about. So to hear the Pope, he basically writes this letter and he says, artists, understand that your vocation, your purpose, the reason for your existence is to be the ones on the earth that point to beauty, that see it and point to it and express it. And it's just like I had never thought about the fact that some people are wired with the proclivity, with the natural urge to do that, and some people aren't. So it really is the role of the artist to see beauty in the world and just to point at it so everyone else can like, oh my gosh. And that it fired me up to read that. It was really cool.
Yeah, it's yeah, well said. You know, it's funny. I was raised, so I had an interesting um, upbringing, which I credit do a lot of the way I see and think about and write about the world, which is um, my mom is like a very devout Catholic. She has a ton of faith. Was always pestering us to go to mass with her every Sunday. And then my father on the other side, agnostic, but they were both deadheads, and they toured the Grateful Dead together. Saw over, I think together they saw over like 300 shows. Like my dad has a tape room of dead tapes. So
No, he does
that's like
not.
that like if my mom is a Catholic, then my dad like worships at the altar of Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir. And what I always think is like so anyway, so I'm kind of at like that intersection of like, because the Grateful Dead, I mean, if you have not been to a Dead and Company show, like you don't understand that. Like I highly recommend. There's a great document. Have you seen that documentary on Amazon, Long Strange Trip?
Oh yeah.
You've seen it, right?
Yeah. Phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean that was a people. If you're not familiar with that, I mean, a massive spiritual movement, and there was psychedelics and free love, and it came out of the '60s. But I think that whatever's going on with that is the same thing that's going on in these mystical experiences. I don't think any of us are going to die and get to heaven, and it's going to be like, you know what, the Catholics were right. Everyone else, thanks for playing, but I think
Yeah.
these organized religions are like they're like booster rockets to get you thinking on that higher plane and those higher levels, and that's why people like Thomas Merton and Alan Watts and the spiritual thinkers, Richard Rohr, they thread them all together, and it's
They end up
like this is. Go ahead.
I mean, they end up being open and engaging in this conversation of could it be that the East has something, well, I'll say it this way, could it be that the West has something to learn from the East and that the East has something to learn from the West? And that, um, man, it's just not something that I grew up, it wasn't okay to ask that question. But man, I think it's a really interesting one.
It's yeah. I mean, in many ways, like it's the question, and
How do you mean?
I think what you're getting at, like what is actually happening here, this whole thing, like we go about our lives getting so like in our routines and these comforting routines, and we ways to feel important, but the nature of it, and I think psychedelics help your thinking get to this level. If it's not, it's like what is actually going
Nick,
on.
you there?
This is
You got me?
extremely absurd. Yeah, can you hear me? What, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
so what I'm going to
Yo.
do, I I've written down like every time that this has happened. So we'll just edit it right out. But just continue on. You were
Yeah,
saying I think psychedelics help your.
yeah. I think I think a psychedelic experience helps the scales fall out from your eyes, and you're kind of able to be like, this is like just a ridiculous existence we're in, and it's beautiful and it's complex, and it's super. You can't you with language can't do it justice. Like if you ever eat a bunch of mushrooms and go on a beautiful and stand in the beautiful like wheat field with your good friends, and you're just in awe of how incredibly beautiful it is, and you can see currents of energy coming off of the trees and the flowers like that. You can never see the world again the same way, and then you're a little less like worried about like your status report on Monday morning about the digital marketing plan you're working on. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So not that that stuff's like not like you got to work, and that's important, and but I think for me at least, like grappling with these spiritual questions and reading like the great thinkers um, sum it up and theorize it, it's just it's I think it's hopeful. It's like a hopeful way to like live your life. Like it makes you less afraid of, I think, ultimately dying. And then once you aren't afraid, once you're less afraid of that, because you understand that like, man, we're all on one current here. This is like a we're part of nature. Where like you can live your life in a way that is less like afraid.
Mm,
But again, I think language doesn't really do it justice.
yeah. It will. It's definitely. It's impossible to describe something that's indescribable. I mean, if if you're pointing to God and God is indescribable, then there's nothing. All you could ever do your whole life is find a way to help someone see just a little bit, and that's like um, it's crazy. But Nick, I think one thing that I wanted, it's just like interesting. I think about it a lot. You actually mentioned it in one of your essays, but you're talking about the way that alcohol affects like the mind, the psyche versus like psychedelic drugs. And I think one thing that's interesting, and I mean, my mom's gonna kill me, but in my experience, it's like alcohol tends to like I'm down with alcohol. I'm gonna drink a beer with some friends when I leave here tonight. It's awesome. I think it's about your intention, and I feel the same way about any kind
Hmm.
of other drug. But one thing that just in my personal experience, like take out anything that any preconceived notion or what I was told things were like. In my experience, alcohol can tend to dim the world around me, to dull the world. And the you know mushrooms, marijuana certainly is something that it's a heightened sense of reality, and like that is something that the way that I am, it's definitely quite nice. Like, and it's just interesting that the agreed upon standard of our society is that alcohol is this thing that it's allowed to be marketed like it is. We outlawed a lot of these drugs in the 70s, but I just wonder what your commentary would be on that. I know it's something that you care about, and I wonder, lately how you've been thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm aligned with what you're getting at, which is, and I wrote, I think you probably got this from the Tony Soprano peyote essay I wrote, but
Yeah.
there's, yeah, I think alcohol is a dissociative, right? So it numbs you and pulls you away from you. That's why, you brown out or black out and you don't um, remember, and it pulls you away from your presence. Whereas um, psychedelics and certainly mushrooms, you become hyper present and like hyper aware of the world, where like the thought of looking at your phone isn't even an option, because like you can't even believe what your senses are taking in, and it also makes you more empathetic and you're more open, right? Where you give people a genuine compliment. You look at your friend, you say, hey Cole, I just want to let you know, like, I think the art you've been making is really fucking great, and you should keep doing that. And for whatever reason, there's like that's not something that you might say when you're like sober or on alcohol, where you can just kind of tune out. So I think what's interesting is you're totally right. Like the fact that alcohol is just acceptable, right, because of advertising and laws. Like psychedelics have been an integral part of um, ancient civilizations for thousands of years. Like definitely in South America with like the Incans. Um, I experienced some of that culture down there. It's not even they wouldn't even call it a drug. They call it medicine, and like it's no joke. And we, I think, as a Western, relatively, this is all relatively modern thinking that like alcohol is somehow better than mushrooms, right? Like that's why. And I think a lot of people just have to like just ask that second why, right? Like because we certainly, I mean, alcohol is destructive. Like people, I know people where it really is not healthy. It's and it makes your life pretty difficult. And I think what's cool, at least I've noticed it in New York, maybe you have too, is that there seems to be a movement with this next generation where their alcohol is falling a little bit out of favor, and more people are like sober curious, or like California sober, where like they're more interested in smoking pot, maybe taking like mushroom chocolates. I think are pretty big in New York right now, and I'm not advocating for like eating mushroom chocolates and going to a bar. Like I actually think there's something like kind of off with that too. But I think it also comes back to with what we were talking about earlier, like with religion like so far out of favor, people are like looking like again, like I think we're spiritually inclined, like it's part of all
Yeah.
of us, and I think people are seeking meaning
Right.
ultimately. Like that's where I think this is coming from. And if you want to have a meaningful experience, um, take some psychedelics and you 100% will. So,
Yeah.
it's not to say like you should like rely on like obviously this stuff requires like it's you can't take it lightly, and you want to do your research and know what you're getting into, like anything. Like you wouldn't just start making yourself cocktails if you've never done it before. But
Right.
I think it's an interesting paradigm shift, and for all the reasons we've been talking about, I think it's a natural progression.
Yeah, yeah. Well, um, Nick, we've kind of changed the format of this show. Obviously, I started the podcast at the beginning of the year, and um, I mean, I had a lot of things happen in my life, like including losing a job and having to go through that and reorganizing a lot of things. But I also really wanted the format, the way, kind of the feeling of how the 45 was going. I felt that I was kind of just like doing what I saw other people do, which is in a sense how you learn anything. But with this, this has been great, like allowing a little bit more time. I wonder, like, if there's anything that, like, specifically in your mind that we haven't hit on that you want to, use to talk about right now.
Oh man, I think we covered most of it. I would the only thing I would add is that hopefully your audience knows like you did the latest cover art for my story, and you absolutely like just
Yeah.
beautifully you just nailed it, man.
Oh,
And I think
thank you.
that statue, the reason why I picked that or wanted that image, that iconography, was because it's a procession of pilgrims. It's this peak you walk up from Pamplona to Puente la Reina, which is what I key my story in on. You walk up this, it's like relatively high, this high hill. It's called Alto del Perdón, which means the hill of forgiveness. And at the top, there's this like iconic Camino statue of these 12, 12 rusted pilgrims in a procession, and they're pointed west and seemingly walking or heading west. And when I learned about this statue, what it represents is all the different pilgrims over the Camino's 1,000-year history, right? So like it shows like the first person seeking the way, and then it shows when like the medieval merchants were kind of making it about commerce and like taking advantage of pilgrims, and then there was decline because of political and religious unrest. So like for 400 years, like there wasn't a lot of people walking the Camino. And then the last two figures are like modern pilgrims with backpacks that represent this renewed surge of people coming to walk this pilgrimage in modern day. Um,
Yeah.
so I just found I found this incredibly powerful because it was what it really represents is like it's humanity. Like it's the same like the same cycles of people all throughout history, and every one of them is still coming to is called to come walk this pilgrimage, and it's sustained. And I think what's so beautiful about the Camino de Santiago and the story, like this pilgrimage, is like in a way like we're all pilgrims, right? Like David White, the poet, he has like a beautiful book called Pilgrim, and it's just this like this it's actually about the Camino de Santiago. His niece walked it, I think, but it's just all about how we're all whatever like this in this life experience, we're all on together. Like we're all pilgrims walking this path. And on the Camino de Santiago, it's just like you're actually on a pilgrimage walking this path. But it's as figurative as it is um, literal. And I think that's why that procession that you drew just like locks that all in. So you really captured that tension that to me is like just a very powerful depiction of the human spirit, right? Like you talk about like what you talk about. Okay, what makes humans different from animals, right? Like probably the fact that we feel inclined to go walk pilgrimages for spiritual reasons. Like you don't like right? Like
Yeah.
that's a like, what is going on with that? So
Yeah. Yeah.
that to me that to me is just really cool. And that's what I'm trying to write about in this story and explore these different pilgrims I met, and ultimately like I'm just telling the story of other people I met, real stories like through my own.
Right. Right. Well, I really hope that you'll continue and write more about that, Nick, and just keep writing, man. I'm excited for everybody listening to this to get to read your stuff, and I really think that your perspective on the world is important, man. And not only that, you're just skilled with words, and so um, it's a joy, bro. And
Cool,
hey,
thanks.
let me say thank you. That the cover for the Camino story was like my first piece of art that I ever made a dollar on. So if anything ever comes from the art, I will always just say thank you to you.
Well, that was overdue. I mean, your stuff's great. So just don't go make a NFT collection out of it.
You take what you wish for.
Yeah, but who
So,
knows? Maybe we can maybe we can get some cash that way. But yeah, man, thanks so much, and thanks for doing this. I think I love listening to your conversations and your perspective, and yeah, I'm looking forward to keeping it going.
hey man, trying to figure out one day at a time.
That's right. That's all I can do.
All right.